Just wanted to give an update on the development progress for Javelin Strings Lite. So far, I've got the violins and the cellos in pretty good shape, I think. But before I walk through the interface here, I'll play back this demo that I've put together that makes use of the majority of articulations and features available. The demo is using 3 tracks of the violins and 3 tracks of the cellos, simulating how you would write for divisi sections. The master bus does have a little smidgen of reverb on here. It's just at 18%, the LX480 Essentials. And then the stock Cubase maximizer just to bring the levels up. But apart from that, everything you hear is out of the box, Javelin Strings Lite. So here's the interface of Javelin Strings Lite. All subject to change, but it's getting there, I think. In the middle, you have your grid of available articulations. And this whole top half of the interface are the controls that are relevant to the articulation that is selected. So as you change articulation, the available options surrounding it will also change. In the top left corner, we've just got a basic title and icon for the articulation that's selected, plus the key switch selector and latch toggle. And latch simply means that the articulation will remain selected until you select another articulation. So the scoops and falls, for instance, are non-latching by default, which means if you have staccatissimo selected and then you use the scoops key switch, it will revert back to staccatissimo once you release the scoops key switch. Just like that. The reasoning behind this is that these flourishes and performative articulations are less likely to be a dominant articulation in a passage and more of a one-off that gets thrown into a phrase. You get the picture. Now, a number of the articulations sampled for Javelin Strings and Javelin Strings Lite make use of multiple dimensions or pools of samples. So for example, the staccatissimo is pulling from 3 different pools of samples as you play it. It's using non-repetition samples, repetition samples, and then some alternate samples, which can either be forced by the key switch or you can leave it up to the engine to decide which one to use automatically based on the MIDI that's being performed. Similarly, this patch is made up of down bow and up bow strokes, and it will automatically alternate between the two, just as a player would, unless you force one over the other. You can click any one of these performance options to force it on as a latched key switch, and you can reset it back to automatic either by clicking automatic or by pressing more than one key switch simultaneously. So I'll press F and F sharp 0 at the same time, and that resets back to automatic. I'll turn that off and I'll move across to the next page of options over on the right. This is where things get a little bit nerdy and won't be important for probably the majority of users, but it's there in case you really like to tweak things. So at the top, we've got a number of parameters that are relevant to the automatic mode And what this is essentially saying is that, for instance, if you wait longer than 900 milliseconds between notes, it will reset to a downbow sample for the next note. If you play notes within 600 milliseconds of each other, it will trigger the repetition samples. If you play notes within 150 milliseconds, then it will prioritize the alternate samples and blur the attacks. Each of these behaviors can be turned off or modified to a value that you prefer. Underneath that, you can randomize the pitch and timing of the notes. The pitch works both ways, so if you set the value to 10 cents, it will randomize the pitch within 10 cents below the recorded pitch and 10 cents above, so it's essentially giving you a 20-cent range to pull from. The timing only works in one direction, that is, it's adding delay, but it is still randomized. I'll control click to reset those to 0. Now all three of these performance options give a subtle variation in the character of the samples. The repetition samples are pulled mostly from rhythmic phrases where the musicians were performing rhythmically without leaving significant gaps between each note. This often results in a more lively character in the samples, and the musicians can usually keep in time a little bit tighter with each other. It also tends to result in a slightly more brushy character with a less pronounced front of the note. The consequence of this approach, though, is that when you're pulling samples from a performance, you don't get a clean start into the note, as you're going to have decay from previous notes that were performed during the phrase that this sample was taken from. My way of getting around this was to also sample non-repetition samples where we had enough gaps between each note that you can get a clean start. In practice, what this means is by playing a phrase with the staccatissimo patch, for example, the first note you play will be a non-repetition, it'll be a clean front, and then any following note that you play within the auto repetition time threshold will trigger a repetition sample. As soon as you leave it long enough, the next sample will trigger a non-repetition again. So just to compare those two for you, I'll play a few notes with a non-repetition forced on and then some with a repetition forced on. The alt or alternate samples are essentially round robins that didn't quite make it into the best of the best, so they're usually a little bit looser or perhaps even slightly pitchy and essentially imperfect. Moving on to the short sustains, these follow a similar concept to the repetition and non-repetition pools of samples, but they're just renamed differently. Functionally, they are the same, but we have real recorded rebowings of the same note. Those function as the repetition samples, or we have a new bow where the note starts with a clean front. Rebow samples will automatically be triggered if your sustain pedal is held down, or if your notes are triggered really close together. You also have two available variations for these short sustains. You can start with an accented front, or you can start with a soft attack. I'll play some notes without any variation active, and then I'll trigger the accent, and then I'll trigger the soft attack. Now, those variations will also play into the rebow samples if you keep that variation active. The short sustains also use release samples, and so you'll see the release knob is faded and we have a real button that appears. If you turn that off, it will stop using release samples and it will just use an envelope release, which is essentially just a volume fade out. You can adjust the length of the release samples from the spanner menu. You can also switch them off and on from here. The shorter values will feel like a faster cutoff. Let me disable the old verb there. And there's some internal reverb on as well. I'll turn that off just for this demonstration. Turn that to the max. Now the variation attack knob controls how quickly you fade in from either the soft attack or the accented attack. So using the soft attack as an example, I'll just click it so that it latches on. We can change how long it takes to reach its destination dynamic. So a short attack time will be a relatively quick fade in. A long variation attack will be a much longer crescendo. Pizzicato does not give the option between repetition and non-repetition samples. It is actually made up of repetition samples primarily, but the pool of round robins was ultimately built from both non-repetitions and repetitions in a way that it ended up not making much sense to keep them separate. However, they do have very minimal pre-note sound, even with the repetition samples. And just as with the Staccatissimo, there are alternate samples available for Pizzicato. In the spanner menu, we have control over whether it automatically pulls from the alt pool of samples or not when you play quickly. Now, playing pizzicato notes within this time frame is ultimately not idiomatic to the instrument, so I wouldn't recommend it. But in case you want to fool around with that, it will attempt to soften the attacks and make it a little bit messy by default. The scoops and falls, as well as the other embellishment articulations that will be available in the full version of Javelin strings, do not offer repetition versus non-repetition samples. They're just good old-fashioned play a note and trigger a sample with no faffing about. Now in the bottom half of the interface, we have envelope controls like attack and release, plus sample offset. Now this can be thought of as the pre-delay before you hit the main energy of the note. It's set to 50 by default, and this is global across all articulations. So if using expression maps or key switches or some other articulation triggering system, all the articulations should theoretically work with the same track pre-delay. It also allows you to change the pre-delay amount in case you want it to be consistent with other tracks that you're using from other developers, for example. However, if you do end up adjusting the offset, either increasing or decreasing, it's recommended that you change the attack envelope along with it. Next to those controls is the mixer. Now in Javelin Strings Lite, I've pre-mixed all of the signals down to 4 channels. The main signal is made up of a deca tree plus outriggers, presented here as a stereo pair. This signal is generally going to be the backbone of your mix. Now that doesn't mean it will be set to a higher level than the others, but it's generally always there. It captures a balance of detail in the instruments, but also capturing the space around it, without being too ambient. For that, we have the ambient mics. The ambient mics are comprised of what's often known as surround mics, which is a spaced stereo pair a fair bit higher than the Decca tree and usually a bit further back as well. This has been combined with some other mics that were placed deeper into the orchestra at the sides of the scoring stage, plus an array of spill mics or bleed mics, which are essentially the spot mics from the other sections that were left turned on. So for the violins, the spill comes from the spot mics that were used for the violas, the cellos, and the basses. The mid signal is a blend of a pair of ribbon microphones, Coles 4038s for the nerds, and so that signal's combined with a pair of tube microphones that were in front of me, or I should say the conductor's podium, capturing a closer stereo perspective of all sections without functioning like a spot mic or section microphone. Those tube microphones capture a lot of presence, which is really nice to have in the mix at a low level, just to help distinguish one section from the other. And then we have the close mics. The close mics have been left as two separate mono channels instead of bouncing it down to a stereo pair. The close mics are placed inside each section and let you create your own stereo field using these pan knobs. And this is really helpful in determining how wide you want your sections to sound. Next to the mixer, we have some extra channel settings. Now for each channel, this includes pan and width, although for the close signal, a width knob is unnecessary as you just create your own width via the two mono pan knobs. For the other signals, you get a single pan knob and a width knob. You also get a diagram to help illustrate where the microphones were placed. This would have been helpful to show as I was giving my explanations. Oh well. Now you can use the menu at the top or the channel names under the faders to select the channel over here in the channel settings section. You also have your output settings. Whoa! That's a lot of outputs. And that's for if you want to route the different microphone signals to different audio channels within your DAW. But why would you need to do that when you have channel-specific EQs built in? So each channel has its own 3-band EQ that you can configure if need be. Just below the mixer and channel settings, we have a preset menu. So essentially everything you can see and configure in this section here gets saved to a preset. There will be a number of factory presets that you can use, plus the ability to save your own user presets so that you can load them in your other instances that are open and share the same mix across all of your instances. And if you have any friends, you can even share your mix with them. Over to the right, we have a dynamics section. This is largely just a visual aid to show you how many dynamic layers are available, as well as the velocity crossover points at which each dynamic layer gets triggered. Below this ladder of symbols, it will show you the last triggered velocity. Plus a fun little slider thing that shows you which layer you're triggering. To the right of that is a slider that will scale the incoming velocity information to whichever range you set it to. So if you've scaled the velocities down to the lowest 3 dynamic layers, it means you could hit a velocity of 127 and it will only trigger at the top of the scaled range, which would be a mezzo forte. Now this isn't something that you will always find a use for, but I find it useful if I know that I don't want to accidentally trigger any forte or fortissimo samples. I'll pull this down and it just makes it much easier to play softly without accidentally triggering those dynamics. Control click to reset. Now this scaling can be triggered by a CC if turned on. Default is CC2, so if I move my CC2 slider that I have on my desk, voila. If you're a bit weird and you don't like using velocity to trigger short notes, you can actually change it to mod wheel. And now the mod wheel will control this slider here and show you what velocity you are about to trigger. For most of us, I expect we'll want to leave that on velocity. And below this dynamics ladder, we have Sordino or Consordino, aka with mutes. And this also has a key switch value to the left of it that you can change. Now the key switch is velocity sensitive. A low velocity on this key switch will turn Sordino off. A high velocity will turn it on. Now this is still a work in progress, but I am adding a bit more tweakability in terms of under the hood settings. At the moment, I've got a couple of MIDI CCs set up to switch articulations. CC58 is used by some other libraries, so I've gone with that now, but I'm actually thinking I'll change that to CC32, I think it is, which is known as bank select in general MIDI standard and is also used by Spitfire for their UACC control. However, it might still be a little confusing because the articulations in Javelin strings, at least in the full version, won't really conform to Spitfire's UACC standard. They just didn't have all of the options on there, but it might still just be familiar enough. And similarly, you can use a CC to control the performance options key switches. And in the very top left, I do have sections A, B, and C options. Now this is technically what's known as the transposition trick, but I've just built it into the interface to save you a little bit of hassle. So one thing I've really tried to be cognizant of is the expression map workflow or key switch workflow, because obviously there's a lot going on in terms of manual control that's available. And in a multi-style patch with multiple articulations available, that can get a little cumbersome with articulation switching. So I've been playing around with expression maps a little bit. And so you can see I'm using expression maps and the articulation editor to switch between articulations and their variations. The first group of switches are the 5 main articulations: staccatissimo, pizzicato, short sustained, scoops, and falls. And then I have the variations below it. It's still not super slick, so I'm still kind of on the lookout for something a bit easier to handle. Though I am aware Cubase 15 has introduced a new type of expression map, I have not yet updated to see how that works. In any case, all of the articulations will be available as separate patches as well. You will not be forced to use a key switch patch. But I do like to work with expression maps where possible, and so I figured there must be others that do too. And while it may not be the slickest process in the world, it is possible to use every articulation and every variation within one single track. So hopefully I can maintain that for the full version that will potentially have about 24 or so articulations. Ooh. So let's just take a line from the first violins, and I'll try and demonstrate the difference between the repetition and the non-reps and why you might want to force one over the other. So these notes, the first one will be a non-rep and the following notes will all be repetition notes. And then I'm ending on a non-rep. In fact, I'll just turn that off too. I mean, it sounds pretty good, but if you do want that little bit of extra bite on the attacks, force them all to be non-repetitions. possibly most noticeable on that last note, to be honest. It's very subtle. Now with the pizzicato, you can see that I have forced some notes to be the alt samples just to bring a little bit of extra looseness and life into it because it is melodic. Again, the difference will be very subtle, but let's see if we can pick up on any difference. I'll change all notes to non-alt and then I'll turn on alt for all the notes just to make it obvious. Now in my mind, for pizzicato at least, the alternate sample set, it can generally hold up on its own. It still sounds nice, it's still in tune. Some notes have a little extra flam than others, and that makes it very realistic. And so there's absolutely nothing wrong with forcing all notes to be the alt samples, especially in melodic lines where you don't tend to have more than 2 notes on the same pitch in sequence. What else we got? Oh, a little scoop. Lovely stuff. Now I wanted the performance of this line in particular to poke out just a little bit more than what the repetition samples were. The repetition samples are lovely and brushy, but since we're already at quite a low dynamic, I'm forcing the non-rep samples just to bring out the note a little bit more, since this is the melody that I want you to hear the most. So here's the automatic behavior. And here's forced non-reps. Now for the short sustains, you can see that I start off with an accented short sustain, and then I've got the CC64, which is sustain pedal, turned on so that I trigger 2 rebos before 3 short notes and then 3 short sustains again, which are all accented, including the rebos, and ending on 1 long soft attack short sustain. You can obviously hear the dynamics change with velocity. One thing I forgot to touch on with the pizzicato and the violins is that, well, the violins don't have it, but the celli and the basses have a long variation for pizzicato. Now this is not every note, because once you get high up enough in the range of the cello, the notes stop ringing out anyway. So the long notes are only of the lowest octave and a half, roughly. Here's the default short note. And now with the long variation triggered. So that will be quite useful, in particular with basses, where it's more commonly used in the real world. So hopefully that's pretty satisfying as an update for some of you. It might have been a bit long-winded. Apologies. It's not meant to be an official walkthrough, but it kind of went that way, didn't it? The too long didn't watch version is that the violins and the celli are pretty much ready to go for Javelin Strings Lite. The basses are half ready. They're not put into this engine properly yet. I did use a sneaky little bit of bass staccatissimo in the demo. They're quite tasty. Oh, and the cellos do have Sordino too. I do find it quite satisfying to play the violins and cellos together, especially with the short sustains. Soft attack, Sordino is optional. Oh, and I forgot to mention, you can just shove the violins up an extra octave. Especially handy in this scenario.